Welcome to episode 29 of Posture Labs and Alignment Fundamentals. My name is Emma and I'm your host. Thank you so much for being on my channel and for tuning into this series. This might be my favorite posture. It is episode 29, Eka Pada Rajakapotasana. That's because this is Pigeon pose, which is in fact my last name. So if you've been following my channel for a while, I sometimes make jokes, but yes, Pigeon is my real last name. It is perfect because obviously it's a pose that is commonly seen in most yoga classes. I joke around that's my favorite, but it actually might be my favorite regardless of the name, just because of how good it feels. So this episode is my personal favorite. We are going to be working our way into King Pigeon pose, but we'll also just cover regular pigeon pose, as King Pigeon pose is pretty intense. So I would recommend maybe doing this after you warm up a little bit. Do some hip openers like figure four, do some side stretches, maybe some gentle back bends, even if that's just standing, just because to jump right into King Pigeon pose would be a lot. Since I've been warmed up, I'm gonna just jump right into things. I'm not gonna bore you with a warm up, but things you might do to warm up would be, again, like a figure four, standing, seated, or on your back. You could even just do some hip circles, whether that's standing, in tabletop, or downward facing dog, and definitely do some gentle back bends as well. Try to warm up your hip flexors, maybe in a low lunge position. We're gonna go right into things. Most people, I find, yogis or not, are pretty familiar with pigeon pose. It's a stretch that a lot of athletes use in a lot of gym classes or training centers. Most people know pigeon pose just from doing it post-training. So I like to get in from either a tabletop, plank, or down dog. Regardless, whatever you find easiest, let's start by sliding the right knee up behind the right wrist. As you do that, the right ankle is going to come up kind of behind the left wrist, and it doesn't need to be directly behind. So my first tip is, if this is really, really challenging for you, you can make this easier by bringing your right foot back more. So the less degree of a bend you have in this front leg, the easier it's going to be on your hip. The more bend, like as you start to get towards 90 degrees, that becomes a lot more intense on your outer right hip, or whichever hip is forward. So if you want to make it easier, take this foot and bring it back towards you more. You can also use a block, a bolster, a blanket, or really any other prop underneath your right hip. So if your hip feels really far from the mat, place a block or a bolster there so you can at least get into the pose and feel the pose entirely. Again, the blocks are super, super helpful. They are not an easy way out. They're not a cop-out. They actually help you do the pose correctly. So you've got a block maybe, or maybe no block. Now, I like to start here, and personally, my favorite is to come down to my forearms. Again, you could use blocks under your forearms. You could use a block under your forehead, maybe a pillow or a bolster. Now, a lot of times when I cue pigeon pose, this is it. And I find that, King Pigeon pose, where you add the back bend in, is a pretty challenging pose. A lot of people cannot get there. So I'll give you some steps to get there today. But again, it's really important to be warmed up. So you want to make sure you've done a little bit of back bending, some side body opening. Stay here for a few moments. Now, I often see people rolling onto this. So my right leg is forward. I often see people rolling onto this right hip. Now, they're kind of opening up the left hip. Maybe their top of the foot isn't even down anymore, and they're kind of on this side, and maybe it does feel like a nice stretch, but you really want to even out the weight in your hips here. So you want to think about rolling onto that left hip a little bit, pushing the top of your left foot down. You want to make sure those toes are pointing back. They're not sickled in or out. As you do this, it's really easy to crunch the shoulders up, clench your jaw, hold tension in your upper body, so try to relax that as well. Now, if you want to work your way towards King Pigeon pose, again, you can always place a block underneath your right hip. I am going to avoid using a block. You're going to bend your back knee and reach your left hand back for your foot. I like to tug it in a few times just to kind of warm up the knee joint, warm up the hip flexor and the top of the thigh. I'm gonna start by trying to bring this left foot to my left elbow crease. And then my left hand is free, so I can kind of wave at the camera with my left hand. My left hand's facing away from me. Now as I do that, I still want to try to square my torso towards the front of my mat and reach my right arm up. I'll be bringing my right hand behind my head like I'm reaching for my upper back. Then I'm going to try to clasp my hands, so my right hand and my left fingers, maybe just the fingers to start. Again, I'm trying to turn my torso forward towards the front. Eventually, my right hand may be able to reach back for my right big toe, and then I can unthread this left arm and grab the left foot from the outside. Now, as I do that, I've got both sides of my feet, my biceps hugging in, and I'm looking up. Hug the elbows in. Keep trying to twist your torso forward. Maybe look up. Eventually, your head will lean back to tap your toes. I am definitely not quite there today. Try to release without slingshotting. So as you can see, this pose is very intense. So not only really intense on the front hip, it's pretty intense contraction in your thoracic spine. So on the right side, I can really feel that in my middle back, my upper back. So you want to make sure you're prepared to do the pose. Don't force it. So when I first grabbed my foot, you could also use a strap there, a strap around your foot, and then grabbing that with both hands is a wonderful way to practice, just like you might do for like a king dancer pose while you're standing. Let's go ahead and do that on the other side so I can show you. So we'll start in our regular pigeon pose, sliding the left knee up behind the left wrist. Adjust the pose to make it more comfortable for you. You want to spend a few moments in your pigeon pose, evening out the weight in your hips, making sure your back toes are pointing back. So now that you know in king pigeon pose how much it is on this back hip flexor, you might take a little bit more time, kind of lean into it, allow that right quadricep to help soften. And again, maybe I'll use a block on this side. So left hip coming onto a block. Then I'm going to bend my right knee and reach my right hand back for my foot. I'm going to try to get my toes in towards my elbow crease. And then my right hand will be waving this time away from the camera. So away from me, off of the mat. I'll reach my left arm up and go for the middle of my upper back. The entire time I'm trying to turn my torso forward. And then maybe I'll reach for my fingertips. So kind of more of like some people call this mermaid pose. Try to square the torso forward. Maybe I can keep leaning back. My right hand kind of helps to guide my left hand towards my left big toe. I like to unthread that right arm and then reach back for the outside edge of the foot. The block is helpful because I can kind of lean into the block a bit. Keep squaring the torso forward. Push the spine in towards the heart. And release when you're ready. It's a very big pose. Again, most people I find don't really even, if I give the option for this like in the in-person class, maybe 25% of the room will even go for their back foot. I find that pigeon pose on its own, just reclined forward, is more than enough sensation in your hips, your hip flexors. So it's not even always necessary to go for the back bend. What else? I guess that's pretty much it for this pose. Like I said, using a strap is helpful. Using a block under your hip is helpful. You could also use a prop that's more comfortable, something soft like a bolster, a pillow, maybe a blanket rolled up would be nice as well. If you have a lot of props, you can always put props underneath your forehead, your forearms, make this a little bit more relaxing. Sometimes in pigeon pose, I find it nice if we're just leaning forward, regular pigeon pose. I like to thread the opposite arm through, like thread the needle pose. You could even go head to a block here. So this way, if my left knee is forward and my right leg is back, I'm threading my right arm underneath. So not only am I getting a nice opening through my right shoulder, my upper back, this is also helping me shift some weight into the right side when it's a little bit easier for most of us to lean onto the leg that's forward. So if we're in pigeon pose on the left side, a lot of people are leaning over to the left. Threading that arm through kind of helps me bring my weight over to the right and even out the weight in my hips on my own. Keep pushing the back of the foot down, or the top of the foot down, the back foot. And release. If pigeon pose hurts your knee joints, so people who've had knee injuries or surgeries, it is not recommended to do pigeon pose. You can take seated figure 4, cross your ankle over your thigh, push your low back in, sit up nice and tall, or same thing on your back, cross your ankle over your thigh and then pull your legs in towards you. It's not the exact same, but you're gonna get a very similar stretch on your outer hips without so much pressure on your knee joints and your ankle joints. Let me know if you have any questions about pigeon pose. If you have any other helpful tips or tricks, something you learned from a teacher, always open to learning something new. I hope you enjoyed this episode about my favorite pose, Eka Pada Rajakapotasana, King Pigeon Pose. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments, and I will see you back next week for big episode 30.